Hello, everyone. My apologies for being a minute late. I hope everyone is well, and I'm happy that we're able to once again come together and to speak a bit in Torah about the upcoming days that we're about to go into. And I'm going to preface by saying that I believe that the shir that you're about to hear is a shir that does not assume that you're a Zionist, and therefore you have to celebrate Yom Haatzmaut, but rather, even if you're quote unquote an anti-Zionist, namely someone that doesn't believe that the miracles that we've seen in the last 70-something years are something of significance, I believe, would have to agree that something changed halachically on Hey B'Iyar Tafshin Chet on that famous May 14th, 1948. And what indeed changed on that day? In order to start, if you look at the source sheet on the screen, you'll see that there's a famous Ramban. Nachmanides, when he wrote glosses on the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot, he was a bit, I would say, sure of himself. He didn't call the book glosses. He didn't call the book My Humble Objections, but rather he called it Shichechat Sefer Shichechat Ha'asin La Rambam, namely positive commandments that the Rambam forgot, or negative commandments that the Rambam forgot. He was so sure of himself that he said, the Rambam must have forgotten them, quote, end quote. And therefore, from this perspective, he went ahead and he said, this is one of the mitzvot that he forgot. Mitzvah number 4, he forgot to count the mitzvah of living in Israel. And he defines the mitzvah of living in Israel as 2 things. And look at the bold, to not allow Israel to go under foreign sovereignty, or to let it be desolate. And I'd like to open with that Ramban and talk about the first 2 things that changed because of Yom Haatzmaut. Namely, once Jewish hands got sovereignty over Israel, then resettling the land under Jewish sovereignty changed something for the Jewish people. Now they can live in Israel and function in Israel. And in order to introduce this, let's go to someone that's not a modern Orthodox Jew. Let's go to someone that fought tooth and nail against the reform movement of his time, and to be more precise, against anything new, and that is the Chasam Sofer. So the Chasam Sofer is sitting in Hungary. He's sitting there in the 19th century. He ends every drasha with Chadash, Asur min HaTorah, anything new is forbidden. And the Chasam Sofer says in his Perush to Sukkah, Daf Lamed Vav, that when it comes to working in Israel, then Ha'avodah Bakarka, Gufa, Mitzvah Mishub Yeshuv Eretz Yisrael. When you work the land in Israel, namely, you go to your garden on Friday and you water the trees, or you collect the fruit off the trees, that in and of itself is a mitzvah. And indeed, when you read in Shema twice a day, Ve'asafta deganecha, and you shall gather your grain, it means in Israel, because in Israel, it's a mitzvah. And he goes on to say, if you look at the 3rd line, that Efshar, probably, afilu sharei umanuyot, sheyesh bahem yeshuv ha'olam, hakol bichlal mitzvah. Namely, if you're in America, like I am right now, and you happen to be putting on tefillin, or you daven this morning chachris and musaf, you're doing a mitzvah. But the fact that you go to the store and you buy a bottle of water, that in and of itself is not a mitzvah. It's a cup of water. When you make a bracha, you're doing a mitzvah. Says the Ramban, anything you do in Israel, anything, is part of the mitzvah of Yeshuva Aretz. It's part of the mitzvah of living in the land. And therefore, the bottom line is, the fact that we're there, we're not leaving it desolate. First and foremost, thank God the land is flourishing with fruits and vegetables. As Rabbi Gold Rabbi Shalom Gold liked to say, if you want to talk to God, you go to the Kotel. If you want God to talk to you, you go to Machane Yehuda. And you see all the fruits and vegetables that the land has produced since Jewish hands started to deal with it. But more than that, anything you do in Israel, from sitting on your couch and watching TV to going to your garden, is part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Haaretz, to the extent that maybe we have to think, says the Chasam Sofer, that we'd be not obligated in other mitzvot because we're doing this mitzvah. He rejects that, but he says the very assumption makes sense because everything you do in Israel is a mitzvah. So the first thing that changed on Yom Haatzmaut so many years ago is that everything we do in the land of Israel is part of Yishuv Haaretz, from sitting on the couch to collecting our fruits, and it's all a mitzvah. It's all part of the mitzvah. It's not just an act, it's a mitzvah. Number 2, ripping your shirt on the cities of Judah. So, the Ramban said that we cannot allow Israel to go into non-Jewish hands. In his words, v'lo na'azva b'yedei zulatenu mina umot. The Shulchan Aruch paskins, based on the Gemara in Moed Katan, that when you see one of the cities of Judah, and they are bechurbanan, in their destruction that we'll have to define, then you rip your shirt. That's what's paskind in Shulchan Aruch, based on the Gemara in Moed Katan. Going down the source sheet here, you could see that the question that the poskim deal with is, what does it mean in its state of destruction? Namely, does it mean that there's no houses there? Does it mean that there's no Jews there? Does it mean other things? It happens to be that on this issue, both the Beit Yosef and the Bach agree. Now, I want to explain why that is fascinating. The Beit Yosef wrote the House of Yosef, the Perush on the Torah, called the Beit Yosef. The Bach, living in Krakow, didn't agree with everything the Beit Yosef wrote. So he not only wrote an alternative Perush to the Torah, but rather he called it the Bayit Chadash, the new house. Namely, I have the better house, the new house, the more sophisticated house. But on this issue, they both agree. And the Bach says, as you can see here on the source sheet, that based on the Psukim in Yirmiyah, there was a story there about the assassination of Gedaliah, where it says, and this is the source in the Gemara for ripping your shirt, Vayavohu anashim mishchem, they came from Shechem, Eino lomar shekaru Shechem v'Shilo v'Shomron shenarei Yisrael. They didn't rip their shirt because they were in Shechem or Shiloh, because that's in the inheritance of Israel, not cities of Judah. But rather, as they were walking, they passed by the cities of Judah, and they ripped their shirt. However, there were still Jews living in Israel, as you know. In other words, Gedaliah's assassination ended the Jewish living in Israel. Beforehand, Jews still lived in Israel, but the sovereignty was foreign sovereignty. And even though Jews were living in those cities, says the Bach, they still ripped their shirt. From here we learn, says the Bach, Afilu yesham yeshuv, the place is filled with Jews. Kol sheyada umot sholetet alav bechorbanan mikrei. So for this law of ripping your shirt for the cities of Judah, it is not dependent on how many Jews are there. It's not even dependent on how many houses are there. It's dependent on one thing. Is it under the sovereignty of the Jewish Israeli government or not? If it is, you don't rip your shirt. And I ask you all, have you ever been told by any rabbi to rip your shirt on the cities of Judah? I'm not talking about ripping your shirt on Har HaBayit. That's a totally different halacha that has to do with not having a Beis HaMikdash. I'm talking about the cities of Judah. And the answer is, of course not, because the cities of Judah today, thank God, most of them are in the hands of the Jewish people. And therefore, you would not have to rip your shirt if it's in the hands of the Jewish people. In other words, in 1948, on that day, all of a sudden, this halacha that has been kept for years, even though there were Jews living there, did not have to be kept anymore because it is now under Jewish sovereignty. And as I said earlier on this issue, the Beit Yosef agrees with the Bach, or the Bach agrees with the Beit Yosef. As a matter of fact, he says it explicitly, Arei Yehuda bechor banan, says the Beit Yosef, Dechol shehein b'yedei hagoyim, if they're in the hands of non-Jews, afal pi sheyesh b'hen yeshuv, it is as big as the amount of Jews in Borough Park. Bechor banan mikrei, it's considered a city that's desolate. And that's the way the Mishnah Berurah paskins too. So the second thing that changed on Yom Haatzmaut halachically is this particular halacha is no longer relevant if there's a Jewish government that has sovereignty over those cities of Judah. So not only is everything we're doing in Israel a mitzvah, but the fact that we have a Jewish government actually took this law and said, no longer relevant. Hopefully, it will never be relevant again. Third change, and that is a Gemara that we've been learning for years in many places we were outside of Israel. Many, many people have learned this Gemara, and I have to be honest with you, dream, maybe one day we'll get to it. So around Purim time, we read about Amalek, and around Purim time, it comes up. It comes up that indeed there's a mitzvah to kill Amalek. Later on in the year, in the summer, after the 3 weeks, the 9 days, during that period of time called Ben Hazmanim, around the time that Elul starts, we read the Parsha of Shoftim, and we read about the fact that God commanded, or didn't command, big machlokes, but definitely a mitzvah to actually have a king. So twice a year, Jews said, one day we'll get back to Israel, and one day we'll have a king, and one day we'll be able to kill Amalek. And indeed, the Rambam paskins, Shalosh mishvot nitztavu Yisrael b'sha'at knisatan la'aretz. There's 3 mitzvot that the Jewish people have a command to do when they return to Israel, or when they come into Israel. Number 1, lemanot lahem melech. Rambam assumes it's a mitzvah to have a king and to have a Jewish leader over the land of Israel. Number 2, lahachrit zarosh shel Amalek. And number 3, to build the Beis HaMikdash. Well, my question is, how much of this halacha did we already fulfill nowadays? In other words, how much of this halacha did we, thank God, been able to see and come to fruition? Let's start with the first, lemanot lahem melech. Now, we all know that we don't have a king over Israel. There's no king in Israel. I did see on YouTube a show called Bibi the King, or King Bibi, but quite frankly, the Prime Minister of Israel is not a king. He's called the Prime Minister. So the question is, did we fulfill this halacha? So I want to introduce you to a Malbim. The Malbim is a perush on the Chumash, but Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said he was one of the gedolim of his generation. His bad luck was that he wrote a perush on Chumash. So when you write a perush on Chumash, no one really holds from you, quote unquote. But indeed, the Malbim was a gadol b'Yisrael. And the Malbim writes, Yesh hevdel ben Melech leben Moshe. When indeed the brothers of Yosef said to Yosef, Hameloch timloch aleinu imashol timshol banu, using the word Melech and Moshel, the Malbim picks up and says there's a difference between these 2 terms. The king is someone that's nominated by the people and because the people want him. The Hamoshel hu biyad chazaka. But a Moshel is someone that takes over in a coup. The Ha'isha Moshel biyad chazaka, ifshar sheyeh melech. And if indeed you make a coup and by force you become the leader of the country, you are not a melech. Because a melech must be someone that's the will of the people. Now, true, once a melech is in place, then when he dies, his son's going to take over, etc. It's a monarchy. But the initial making him the melech, like with Shaul HaMelech, was not just the choice of God, but also the choice of the people. As a matter of fact, the Radbaz says the same thing. Hay melech shehumlach al yedei navi. Either the Navi came along and said, he's the guy, like Hashem said to the Navi, pick David. Oh, second choice, we don't have Nevi'im today. Shehiskimu alav kol Yisrael, that all the Jewish people agree to it. So we are living in Israel, and there's elections, and indeed, ultimately, we have leaders that the majority of the people elected. Now, you can start making a lumdus and say, well, at the end of the day, the Likud party doesn't have the majority of the Knesset. But the bottom line is that once there is a majority of a coalition that says he's the leader, that is, in essence, the Jewish people coming and saying that we want this leader to lead us. So I believe that we have fulfilled this halacha today, and that is limanot lahem melech. And indeed, the Rambam himself in Ilchot Gezela Va'aveda, talking about when you are liable for theft, comes along and says, "Bamed varim hamurim b'melech shematbeo yotze ba'otam haratzot, shaharei yeskimu b'nei oto haaretz v'samcha da'ata alav shehu adoneihem v'hem lo la'avadim." When you pay someone with money, it has to be money that's legitimate money. The legitimate money is based on the government saying this is money. Namely, if you give a lira today, it's not money. If you give shekel, shkalim chadashim, it is. And that's a legitimate king. Why? Hiskimu b'nei otah haaretz, because the people agreed that this should be our king. Aval, says the Rambam, if you're talking about money that comes out of a guy who made a coup and by force took position of being the sovereign over the land, then he's a gazlan and his money is insignificant. More than that, if you look at the middle column, you'll see that indeed the Rambam says, "En hamelech nilcham tchila ela milchemet mitzvah." We have two kinds of war: an optional war, milchemet reshut, and what unfortunately we're fighting now, milchemet mitzvah. Be'ezohi milchemet mitzvah, says the Rambam, amongst many things, is Rat Yisrael miyatzar, going ahead and assisting the Jewish people against forces that are attacking them, which is exactly what's happening now. And just in case you think that the word melech here would mean monarchy and not government, comes to Meiri, he says, Malchei Yisrael, o manhigehem, either the kings of Israel or their leaders. And what do? They nilchamim im oivehem hem milchemet mitzvah. If they go ahead and save the Jewish people from their enemies, it is considered a milchemet mitzvah. So the third thing that changed since Israel was created is we have fulfilled, in my opinion, this mitzvah called lemanot lahem melech. In the words of Rav Kook on the right side, aval keshemitmaneh manhig ha'uma lechol tzarkea b'sigon malchuti. When indeed you nominate a leader who takes care of all the needs of the country, al pi da'at ha'kahal v'da'at beitin, and he's nominated based on the will of the people, v'aday omed hu b'makom melech, he's considered a king. So that's the third thing that we were zoche to do since 1948. And the fourth thing is lahachrit zaro shel Amalek, to indeed eradicate Amalek. Who's Amalek? So if you say Amalek is a nation, Sancheriv came and he mixed up all the nations, we don't know who he is. But if you say Amalek is not a nation, but as Rav Soloveitchik said here on the left side, Amalek is an idea. In his words, in the name of his father, Rav Moshe, Kol umaha matzira, any nation that says Shemindedinuta, its credo, Hu lahashmid et ha'ama Yehudi, its credo is to destroy the Jewish people, Hu Amalek, it's considered Amalek. So from the Hamas to the Hezbollah to the Iranians to many others, they said, we want to destroy the Jewish people. Fighting against them and successfully fighting against them is lahachrit zaro shel Amalek. So the fourth halacha that we were zoche to fulfill since 1948 is the second passage of this Rambam that for years, around Purim time, they said, maybe one day, and that is lahachrit zaro shel Amalek. Unfortunately, we're still working on it, and we have not yet totally eradicated it. But as we speak, we are trying. So to sum up until now, before we go to the second page, ever since 1948, we have the privilege to live in Israel, which means everything we do is a mitzvah, according to the Chasam Sofer. Number two, the halacha of ripping your shirt becomes irrelevant if it's under Jewish sovereignty, and it is. Number three, we have fulfilled the mitzvah of lemanot lahem melech halachikly. And number four, we have been working and continue to work lahachrit zaro shel Amalek. And hopefully, if indeed the Rambam is going in ascending order, then we're not far, hopefully, from the next clause of livnot et beit habechira. Turning the page now, I'd like to go to another aspect that changed in 1948. And this, I believe, is the biggest chiddush of this year. Because quite frankly, everything I said until now is, I would say, normative. But what I'm about to say now is a bit of a chiddush. And that is to try to explain, why is it that every Jew is obligated to write a Sefer Torah for himself? According to the Rosh today, we fulfill that mitzvah by having Sfarim at home that we learn from. But every Jew has to have either Sfarim or a Sefer Torah for himself. If you look on the left side of the page, you'll see that according to the Psukim in Devarim, a Melech not only has to write that Sefer Torah as a fellow Jew, but has to write an additional Torah because he's a melech. The Hayakish Shifto al Kisei Mamlachto, when he finally sits on his throne, the Chatavlo et Mishneh Torah Azah Sefer, and he has to write the Torah. And the Karabo Kol Yamei Chayav, and he has to read from it, and from this he'll learn to have awe of God and not to do Averas, etc. And indeed, the Rambam, when he writes what he believes is the 613 commandments, commandment number 17 is Sefer Torah La'atzmo. A king has to have a Sefer Torah. And in mitzvah number 18, he writes, and I quote the words of the Rambam, every Jew has to have their own Sefer Torah. My question is, why is it that you need to have two Sifrei Torah if you're a king? Why is it that you need to have two and not one? What does that additional Sefer Torah add to your life? I would like to suggest, based on what I heard from Rav David Stav, that indeed we have two Torahs. One Torah is for personal behavior or for communal behavior. That's the Torah we usually quote. But there's another Torah, and that is the Torah of running a nation. And that Torah has different rules and regulations than the regular Torah. And I'd like to explain what I mean by a few examples. Let's go for the first example, war. A Jew is not allowed to put himself in danger. So you can't drive haphazardly, and you can't jump off a cliff without proper precautions. It's an isser. You're not allowed to put yourself in danger. Pikuach nefesh is more important than the Torah, except for the three cardinal sins. So let me ask you all a question. If that is correct, and we even violate Yom Kippur for pikuach nefesh, how do we go to war? By definition, by going to war, you are putting yourself in danger. Indeed, the Sefer HaChinuch, when he talks about killing the 7 nations, the Canaanites, the Prezis, the Yevusis, etc., he basically says, if you happen to be walking down the street and you see one of them, and you can kill him, without you personally being in danger, and you didn't kill him, you actually did not fulfill this mitzvah. Comes along the Minchas Chinuch on the Sefer HaChinuch. The Minchas Chinuch with a Galiciana with the name Rav Babad. I don't know how the Galiciana gets the name Babad, but in any case, he comes and says, I don't understand. He just said, you can only go to war if you don't put yourself in danger. But quite frankly, he says, are you out of your mind? There's no such thing. Yadua, he says, Uvederech ha'olam, sheneragim mishnei tzaddim be'et ha'milchama. During war, people get killed. That's part of war. So if the Torah says there's a milchemet mitzvah, and the Torah says there's a war against the 7 nations, and there's a war against Amalek, how can you ever go to war? Pikuach nefesh. Im kain. If so, Chazinan, we see from here, the HaTorah gazra lilchom imahem af tehu b'sakana. Even if it puts yourself in danger, as many of our fellow soldiers, part of our congregants, and so many of our friends are, you are obligated to go to war. So what does the Minchas Chinuch mean? Only if there's no pikuach nefesh. And therefore he ends with v'tzarich iyun. Comes Rav Kook in his responsum and explains, this is what the two Torahs means. In other words, a king is not only allowed to go to a milchemet mitzvah, but even to a milchemet reshut. And he ultimately says, the milchama b'halachot sibur shani. When it comes to war, it's not a personal behavior decision, like, will I use a Shabbos elevator? Will I rely on the Eruv? But rather, it's a national decision. They are not governed by the things that govern personal behavior. Whoever is the leader, he has to make these, again, national decisions. So whether or not you use a Shabbos elevator or how you make a cup of tea is up to you. That's in the first Torah. But the second Torah is for these national decisions, such as war. Umishum hachi. And because of this, says Rav Kook, tzarich, he needs to have 2 Sifrei Torah. One Sefer Torah is for his personal behavior, namely how to make a cup of tea on Shabbos. And the second is for the communal decisions. And from this perspective, Rav Kook comes to the conclusion, indeed, when it comes to personally, I have to drive carefully. I can't put myself in danger. But when it comes to national decisions, by definition, a war is a national decision. Obviously, pikuach nefesh is not part of the puzzle because by definition, a war involves pikuach nefesh. That's why, says Rav Kook, he needs two Torahs. One Torah for his personal behavior, like every Jew, and the other for the national questions. I'm not getting into it now, but the question of what price to pay to get back the precious hostages that we daven for and worry about every day is a national decision. It's not a personal decision. It's a national decision. And that is given to the leaders. Give another example. Are you allowed to sin on behalf of the Jewish people? So I'm not allowed to sin on behalf of a fellow Jew. That's absolutely not allowed. Is a big sugya, but at the end of the day, it's not allowed. You're not allowed to sin for the behalf of another Jew. But am I allowed to sin on behalf of saving all the Jewish people? And who is the example of someone that sinned in order to save all the Jewish people? We just read about her 2-something months ago. Her name is Esther. She has a book that's named after her. Esther, when she originally went to Achashverosh, it was against her will. So the Gemara says, what did she? She's like someone being raped, lo aleinu. Namely, she didn't go there because she wanted to. There was a decree. She had to. But the second time she went in, after fasting 3 days, etc., especially if you take the interpretation that she was married to Mordechai, so she was an Eshet Ish, she was a married woman. We're talking about a cardinal sin. She went ahead and sinned. We read about it, and we call her Esther Amalka. What a tzadekes. She saved the Jewish people. So how can it be? I'm not allowed to sin for a fellow Jew, and Esther did it, and she's considered a tzadekes, and we named the Megillah after her. Comes along the Noda B'Yehuda, and the Noda B'Yehuda says that ultimately you're right. When it comes to an individual Jew, then you're not allowed to do that. But Esther Shani, Esther was different. Why? She didn't go in to save a Jew. She went to save all the Jewish people that were supposed to be eradicated on one day. And because it's not, again, a personal decision, but a national one, then different rules and regulations apply. And indeed, Esther did the right thing because she was not doing it to save a Jew or a community. She was doing it to save all the Jewish people. And what happens in Israel in every war, what happens in Israel as a nation is governed by that, as I called it, the second Sefer Torah, that ultimately governs what we do, again, not as individuals, but as a nation. The Ein Lemedim, says the Noda B'Yehuda, Hatzalat Yechidim me'atzalat Klal Yisrael, which leads us to a fascinating question, and that is, are we allowed to call the police on Shabbos if we see a robbery? I mean, it's not pikuach nefesh. Obviously, if we see two people trying to kill each other, we can call the police. But we're talking about a guy who goes into a house and is robbing, and we see it. Are we allowed to call the police on Shabbos? It's not pikuach nefesh. So, not surprisingly, our poskim have a machlokas on this, and in my opinion, this is their machlokas. Is there another set of rules for a nation than a set of rules for individuals? So comes along Rav Yoshua Neubert, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, in his famous book Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata, and basically says the same rules and regulation applies to a nation as it does to individuals. Namely, if you see a ganav aparetz l'dira, you see a robber going in to someone's house, because maybe he'll go into a house, there's people sleeping there, he may kill them, so there you're allowed to call the police. That's pikuach nefesh. But he says, if you see a robber not going into a house, but going into a store that's Shomer Shabbos, so it's closed on Shabbos, you're not allowed to call the police, so he'll lose money. Big deal. At the end of the day, Gamim Yefsid, Kol Amono. Who agrees with him? None other than Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, one of my heroes, who I don't think gets enough credit in our communities for what he did for Israel and for the Jewish people. Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, in his shut called Heichal Yitzchak, basically says, and you have the source in front of you, that basically on Shabbos you have to run a police with the rules and regulations as you do at home. Namely, if indeed the police get a call, it could be a pikuach nefesh, they have to get into the car and go to the scene. That's the bottom line. But, he says, the police don't only go and respond when there's something acutely happening. There's something called bitachon shotef. The very fact that there's police cars on the highway makes us all have the fear of God of not driving fast. So what about patrols? Says Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, former chief rabbi of Israel, two things. Number one, if you go to the scene of the crime and everything's okay, you're not allowed to go home. There's no heter to go home. And number two, how are you supposed to do patrols? Use a bicycle. Use a bicycle. A bicycle is obviously quasi if it's even usher on Shabbos, but definitely not at the level of a car in which there's an ignition. He says use a bicycle. So I ask you, a robber is running away in his car. You're going to run after him with a bicycle? Says Rav Herzog, you have no choice. Shabbos is Shabbos. But Rav Shaul Yisraeli disagrees. Rav Shaul Yisraeli, who was the chief rabbi of Kfar HaRoeh, later a Dayan in Beit Adin HaGadol in Yerushalayim, comes along and says that you cannot look at this with individual eyes. You have to look at this with national eyes. In his words, Kol ma shekaruch b'shlom hatzibur. We're not talking about a robbery that happened in a place. We're talking about the peace of the entire nation. Yesh bo ba'akifin inyan shel pikuach nefesh. At the end of the day, you'll get to pikuach nefesh. And he gives an example. Let's say there's a financial situation in Israel which things are not so good. You personally have a job, but financially, there's a lot of people out of work. If the financial situation is not good for the country, at the end of the day, it will get back to you. You will also suffer from the pikuach nefesh, namely, hatzibur yiyeh mechusar parnasa. So ultimately, he says, if a king then thought that a war, an optional war, would bring up the financial situation of the country, he was allowed to go out to an optional war in order to save the country from financial national disaster. Again, we're not talking about the rules and regulations of an individual, but rather that of a country. He gives another example that I think is very, very similar. He says at the end of the day, when you go ahead and let's say there's a pandemic like there was, what you do in your personal neighborhood maybe doesn't have an influence, but at the end of the day, we're talking about national health. And he goes on with examples and says at the end of the day, ba'ofen hatziburi, harei zeh sfeik sfeika v'legabei pikuach nefesh gam zeh muva b'cheshbon. And therefore, he allows the police to work on Shabbos normally, because we're not talking about a store that has a robbery. We're talking about the peace of the people as a people, namely living in a country without robberies. If every robber knew that on Shabbos the police would not run after you, we would have anarchy. And therefore, he says, it runs by different rules and regulations. So the example of Esther, who saved all the Jewish people, the example of a war in which pikuach nefesh is thrown to the side, and finally the example of a police on Shabbos shows us that indeed, since 1948, we have come to a situation in which we have to use that second Sefer Torah that does not govern our personal behavior, but our behavior as a nation, which has total different rules and regulations than the personal Sefer Torah. And I'll just add, and I heard this also from Rav Stav, maybe this will explain a halacha that for many years no one understood. There's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, Shloshim Yom Lifnei Achag, Dorshin B'ilchot Achag. 30 days before a holiday, you start learning about the holiday. So we understand Pesach, because there's a lot of halachos that go into chametz, making matzah, having a kosher home, running a seder. We understand Sukkot, you need to have a kosher sukkah, kosher lulav, etrog, hadassim, and aravot. but for the life of you, why would this halacha apply to Shavuos? What do you need to learn? How to make cheesecake for 30 days? How to make blintzes? I mean, what did the people learn for 30 days? And the Be'er Heitev on the Shulchan Aruch comes along and says, Huatin Shar Yom Tov. This applies to Sukkot. This applies to Shavuos. Quoting the Bach, the Magen Avraham, the Chayei Adam, they all say, yeah, we are now about to get to none other than Hey Iyar. Hey Iyar is a month before Hey Sivan, which is Erev Shavuos. Everyone has to learn about Shavuos for 30 days. Now, what are we going to learn? What's in the curriculum? Hilchos Yom Tov? We know that. We had many Yom Tovim this year. What are we supposed to learn? I believe that the answer is exactly what God challenged us to do on that fateful day in Sivan, right before we got the Torah. Namely, we have to learn that second Sefer Torah. Not the first Sefer Torah that we learn all year and we continue to learn today and we'll learn tomorrow. But rather, what did God charge us with? He didn't say be good Jews. He didn't say you individually keep the Torah. What did God say on the eve of giving the Torah? Ve'atem tihiyu li, and you shall be for me, mamlechet kohanim ve'goy kadosh, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Nation, kingdom. For 30 days before Shavuos, our job today is to learn that second Sefer Torah. What are the rules and regulations that govern not the individual, but the land and the people nationally? And now we can finally understand this halacha. Why did it take 30 days? Because this is untilled territory. No one has yet developed a Shulchan Aruch Lehilchot Tzibur. There's articles, there's responsum, there's so much material out there, but yet we're still struggling with it. How do we run a country, al pi halacha, as a country? And that's that second Sefer Torah. Now you can understand what you do 30 days before Shavuos. 30 days before Shavuos, you deal with how do I nationally run a country? And allow me to end with the following. So we spoke about the fact that on Hey Iyar, Tav Shin Chet, on that beautiful and important day, 70-something years ago, a few things changed for the Jewish people. Number one, everything we did in Israel now became a mitzvah. Number two, we went ahead and said because there's Jewish sovereignty, the halacha of ripping your shirt for the cities of Judah, no longer relevant if it's under Jewish sovereignty. Number three, we nominated a melech. Number four, we continue to lahachrit zaro shel Amalek. And number five, we have now, for the first time in thousands of years, gone back to that second Sefer Torah in order to try and run a country based on the Torah ideals, not for the individual, but for the country. And this would have ramifications on going to war and running a police on Shabbos and so many other things. And allow me to end with the following. I don't believe in coincidences. If God has divine providence over the Jewish people and over the world at large, then I personally don't think that there's coincidences. And allow me to show you one of many non-coincidences that we have and been zoche to. And that is the following. Lo aleinu, we had captives, and we still have captives. If you're in a place without a Jewish calendar, how do you know when the Yom Tovim fall out? Comes along the Shulchan Aruch and says all you need to know is the first day of Pesach. And there's something called Atbash. You take the first letter of the Jewish alphabet, the last letter of the Jewish alphabet, and you go. So Aleph equals tough. Aleph equals tough. Aleph, the first day of Pesach, is tough, Tisha B'Av. Bet equals second letter of the alphabet, the second to last letter, Shin, Shavuos. Indeed, look on your calendar. The first day of Pesach was Sunday. Shavuos this year will be on Monday. The third letter is Gimel, equals Resh. Indeed, the first day of Rosh Hashanah will be Tuesday. This fourth letter is Dalet, the fourth day of Pesach. Dalet equals Kuf, which is Kriyas HaTorah, which is Simchas Torah in Chutz La'aretz. Indeed, Simchas Torah in Chutz La'aretz this year will be on Wednesday. Continuing, he says, Hatz, Hey equals Tzadik. Hey equals, namely, the fifth day of Pesach is Tzom, is Yom Kippur. Fifth day of Pesach this year was Thursday. Yom Kippur this year will be on a Thursday. We'll break our fast, and Friday we'll cook for Shabbos. Vav equals Pei. Vav equals Purim of last year. That's where the Shulchan Aruch ends. That's the end of his Siman on the Jewish calendar. Do you know what we can add to this list today? Two things. Number one is in existence already. The other we have to add. The Shulchan Aruch said in his second clause, Bet equals Shin. Namely, the second day of Pesach equals Shavuos. You know what else it equals? Shichrur Yerushalayim. Every year, Yom Yerushalayim will come out on the day of Shavuos. So Bet equals Shin times 2. Both Shavuos and Shichrur Yerushalayim. And now we have to add to the list. What was the last letter that the Shulchan Aruch quoted? Vav. Now we're going to add one letter. Zayin. Zayin equals Ayin. The seventh day of Pesach will always be Yom Haatzmaut on the calendar, namely Hey Iyar. And if you look in your calendars, Shvi'i Shel Pesach, which was a Shabbos, is also Hey Iyar. And that comes out every single year. I don't think this is by coincidence. I don't think that we live in a world of coincidences. There's divine providence above us, and indeed, we're zoche, after so many years, to continue Rav Yosef Karo with one more letter, or to be more precise, 2 letters. One is already in existence, the other we added. And I hope and pray that this is just the beginning, and we'll be able to continue this list above and beyond with many more miracles that we'll be zoche to see in the next few years. Thank you all very much for listening. Wishing everyone a significant Yom HaZikaron and a happy Yom HaAtzmaut. Mirza Hashem, we should be zoche to many more nisim v'niflaot as we have already been.
Yo,